In 1937, the richest man who had ever lived died in his sleep at the age of 97. At his peak, John D. Rockefeller's fortune was equal to roughly 2% of the entire U.S. economy, a share of national wealth no billionaire alive today, even the richest man on the planet, comes close to holding. He built that fortune by crushing almost every rival he ever faced, by squeezing railroads until they begged, and by controlling 90% of an entire industry that powered the modern world. And then, in the final act of his life, he became the most generous human being who had ever lived, giving away more money than most countries had in their treasuries. This is the story of John Davison Rockefeller, the most feared, most hated, and ultimately most consequential businessman in American history. And it starts, strangely enough, with a con man. His father was a man named William Avery Rockefeller, though almost nobody who knew him ever called him that. They called him Big Bill, or sometimes Devil Bill, and both names fit. Big Bill Rockefeller was a traveling salesman, a bigamist, and one of the most gifted con artists of the 19th century. He roamed the countryside of upstate New York selling fake cancer cures out of the back of a wagon, calling himself Dr. Bill Rockefeller. Though he had never spent a day in medical school, he charged desperate dying people $25, roughly a month's wages, for bottles of colored water and crushed herbs that did absolutely nothing. He vanished for months at a time, sometimes years, living a second life under a different name with a second wife, while his real family scraped by, not knowing if he was alive. He would return unannounced, shower his children with gifts and stories, quiz them on math and business under the guise of play, and then disappear again before anyone could pin him down. He once told a reporter, without a hint of shame, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp." It was a strange, cruel kind of parenting philosophy, but it worked exactly as intended on his second son, because his mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was everything Big Bill was not. She was a devout Baptist, rigid, disciplined, and utterly unwilling to waste a single cent. With a husband who might vanish for a year at a time, Eliza had no choice but to run the household like a military operation. And she trained her children, especially young John, the same way. She kept meticulous records of every expense. She taught her children that idle hands were sinful and that debt was a moral failing. Between an absent con man father who taught him that the world was a game to be won through cunning, and a hyper-disciplined mother who taught him that every penny mattered, John D. Rockefeller was, from the earliest age, being built into something unusual. He wasn't being raised to be a farmer or a tradesman. He was being raised almost by accident to be an empire builder. By the time he was 7 years old, John was already hustling. He raised turkeys on the family's small plot of land in upstate New York, and rather than simply eat them or give them away, he sold them, tracking every bird, every cost, every sale in a small notebook. That habit of writing everything down never left him. Around the same age, he began lending small sums of money to local farmers and neighbors, not as charity, but at interest. He kept a little ledger he proudly called Ledger A, where he recorded every cent he earned and spent for the rest of his life. Most children who found a few coins would run off to spend them on candy. John Rockefeller found a few coins and asked himself how he could turn them into more coins. This wasn't just childhood thriftiness. It was the earliest visible sign of an obsession with compound interest and exact accounting that would define every decision he made for the next 8 decades. He was interested in the mechanics of money itself, how it moved, how it grew, how patience and discipline could turn a small sum into a larger one without any additional labor at all. That mindset was reinforced constantly by the instability at home. With Big Bill vanishing for months and sometimes years at a stretch, young John effectively became the man of the house well before he was a teenager, expected to help manage the family's meager finances and set an example for his younger siblings. There was no room in that environment for carelessness. Every dollar that came into the house had to be accounted for, because there was no guarantee another one was coming anytime soon. Rockefeller later said his father's unpredictable comings and goings taught him self-reliance in a harsh, direct way. He simply could not afford to assume anyone else would take care of him. There was a third influence in that household beyond his father's cunning and his mother's discipline, and it may have mattered more than either. the Baptist Church. Eliza raised her children in a strict Baptist tradition, and young John absorbed it completely, attending services multiple times a week, and, once the family settled in Cleveland, joining the Erie Street Baptist Mission Church as a teenager. He wasn't a passive churchgoer. He taught Sunday school, helped with church finances, and, remarkably, began tithing, giving away a tenth of his income to the church and to charity, starting with his very first paycheck at Hewitt and Tuttle when he was making less than $1 a day. His personal ledger from that period shows small, careful donations recorded with the same precision he applied to every other transaction in his life, sometimes just a few cents at a time to a local widow or a missionary fund. It's a detail people often skip past, but it matters, because it means the instinct to give systematically wasn't something Rockefeller discovered late in life, after he'd made his fortune. It was there from the very first dollar he ever earned, running in parallel with his hunger to accumulate, decades before the world would ever know his name. When the family moved to Cleveland, Ohio in the 1850s, John's formal schooling came to an abrupt end, not because he wasn't smart, but because the family desperately needed income, and Big Bill, predictably, was nowhere to be found. At 16 years old, John Rockefeller set out to find work with a rigid, almost eerie determination. He put on his best suit, and for 6 weeks straight, 6 days a week, he walked the docks and offices of Cleveland, going door to door, asking every merchant and shipping company if they needed a bookkeeper. He was turned down again and again. Finally, on September 26, 1855, a date he would later celebrate every single year of his life as Job Day, treating it with more reverence than his own birthday. A small produce shipping firm called Hewitt and Tuttle gave him a chance as an assistant bookkeeper. They paid him 50 cents a day. It doesn't sound like the beginning of an empire, but for young Rockefeller, that bookkeeping job was an education more valuable than any university. He pored over shipping manifests, freight costs, and commodity prices for grain, meat, and produce moving in and out of Cleveland's harbor. He learned in granular, obsessive detail exactly how goods moved through the American economy, what it cost to ship a barrel of flour by rail versus by lake, how railroads set their rates, how margins could be found in fractions of a cent, multiplied across thousands of transactions. While other teenagers his age were thinking about girls or farms, Rockefeller was thinking about freight rates and the hidden architecture of American commerce. He was, in effect, studying the plumbing of the entire economy before he'd even turned 20. And he never forgot a single lesson of it. He kept that job for a little over 3 years, working his way up from the lowest rung of the office to a position of real trust, handling contracts and negotiating on behalf of the firm, despite being barely out of his teens. He was famous even then, among the older men he worked with, for a kind of unnerving calm under pressure, a refusal to be rattled, flattered, or rushed into a bad deal. Colleagues later recalled that he would sit silently through negotiations, saying almost nothing, letting the other party talk themselves into revealing exactly how much room they had to move on price. It was a skill he had clearly not been taught in any classroom. It looked, more than anything, like the instincts of a con man's son, except turned toward legitimate business instead of snake oil. When Hewitt and Tuttle refused to raise his modest salary quickly enough for his liking in 1859, Rockefeller, not yet 20 years old, simply walked away and started his own firm instead. He never worked for another employer again for the rest of his life. By 19, Rockefeller had saved enough and impressed enough people to strike out on his own. In 1859, with a business partner named Morris Clark, he started a produce commission business, buying and selling grain, meat, and other goods on commission. It was solid, unglamorous work, and it made him modestly successful. But 1859 was also the year that changed everything for the entire world, though almost nobody in Cleveland noticed it at first. That year, in the small town of Titusville, Pennsylvania, a man named Edwin Drake successfully drilled the first commercial oil well in American history. Suddenly, crude oil, until then a strange, messy nuisance that occasionally seeped up from the ground, became the most exciting commodity in America. What followed was one of the wildest gold rushes in American history, except with oil instead of gold. Thousands of men flooded into rural Pennsylvania, throwing every dollar they had into drilling wells, betting everything on the chance that they'd strike a gusher and become instantly rich. Boomtowns sprang up overnight, full of saloons, mud, and desperate men. Fortunes were made and lost within weeks. It was chaotic, lawless, and almost entirely driven by luck. And it was exactly the kind of environment Rockefeller wanted absolutely nothing to do with. While every other ambitious young man in Ohio and Pennsylvania was racing toward the oil fields to drill, Rockefeller looked at the situation with the same cold ledger book eyes he'd been training since he was 7 years old, and he came to a completely different conclusion. Drilling was gambling. You could sink your entire fortune into a well and hit nothing but dry rock. Even the wells that did strike oil were unreliable. Production could spike wildly one month and dry up the next, and there was no way to predict which patch of Pennsylvania hillside would turn into a gusher and which would turn into a worthless money pit. Rockefeller reportedly visited the oil region himself early on, watched the chaos of the boomtowns firsthand, the mud, the fires, the wild speculation, and came away thoroughly unimpressed. But no matter how much oil came out of the ground, and no matter who found it, that crude oil was useless to anyone until it was refined into something people could actually use, mainly kerosene, which was rapidly replacing whale oil as the fuel that lit lamps across America and, soon, the world. Whale oil had gotten expensive as whale populations collapsed from overhunting, and kerosene, cheap and bright burning, was exactly the product a rapidly industrializing, rapidly urbanizing country needed. Rockefeller realized that the real money wasn't in the lottery of drilling. It was in the boring, unglamorous, unsexy business of refining. Whoever controlled refining would eventually control the entire industry, no matter who was pulling oil out of the ground, because it didn't matter whose name was on the well if there was only one door through which the oil could reach the market. In 1863, Rockefeller and Clark, along with a skilled chemist named Samuel Andrews, built their first oil refinery in Cleveland, which they named Excelsior Works. Cleveland had a critical advantage. It sat along both railroad lines and Lake Erie shipping routes, giving it two different paths to move refined oil to the booming markets of the East Coast. And it sat far enough from the chaos of the Pennsylvania oil fields that Rockefeller could focus purely on refining without getting dragged into the drilling frenzy. From the very beginning, Rockefeller ran that refinery the way his mother had run their household, with an obsession over waste that bordered on the pathological. Most refiners at the time treated the process as crude and wasteful, almost by nature. Gasoline, a useless byproduct of kerosene refining at the time, was routinely dumped into nearby rivers because nobody had found a use for it yet, and the stench of wasted petroleum byproducts hung over most refining towns like a permanent fog. Rockefeller looked at that waste and saw money literally flowing away. He figured out how to burn the gasoline as fuel to power the refinery itself, cutting his energy costs to almost nothing. He built his own barrel-making operation because buying barrels from outside suppliers was too expensive, and he even sourced his own timber and iron hoops to build them cheaper still, undercutting outside barrel makers by such a wide margin that it alone gave him a meaningful cost advantage over every rival refinery in the city. Where competitors used 40 drops of solder to seal an oil can, Rockefeller's engineers tested it down to 39, saving a fraction of a cent per can that, multiplied across millions of cans, became a fortune. He fired supervisors who let equipment sit idle. He calculated shipping costs down to the decimal and negotiated with a viciousness that terrified people twice his age. He personally reviewed reports on the exact chemical yield of every batch of crude that came through his refinery, pushing his chemists to extract more usable kerosene, more usable byproducts, more of everything out of every single barrel. This obsession paid off almost immediately in ways his competitors couldn't match. Because his costs were consistently lower, Rockefeller could sell kerosene at prices that were profitable for him, but ruinous for anyone trying to compete without the same discipline. Refining in the 1860s was an industry with almost no barriers to entry. Anyone with a bit of capital could throw together a makeshift refinery, and dozens of small operators did exactly that across Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and the oil regions of Pennsylvania. Most of them were undercapitalized, sloppily run, and vulnerable to even minor swings in crude oil prices. Rockefeller, sitting on a growing cash reserve and a genuinely more efficient operation, was uniquely positioned to survive downturns that wiped out weaker competitors. And he began quietly using those downturns to acquire distressed refineries at bargain prices even before his most aggressive expansion phase began. He was, in effect, running a long, patient siege on Cleveland's oil refining industry years before anyone else realized a siege was underway. In the middle of all this early maneuvering, in September of 1864, Rockefeller married a woman named Laura Celestia Spellman, whom he had met years earlier as a classmate at Cleveland Central High School. Laura, whom he affectionately called SETI for the rest of his life, was in many ways his intellectual match, sharp, well-read, and raised by a father who was an ardent abolitionist and social reformer, which meant she brought her own strong convictions into the marriage rather than simply deferring to her husband's. Their partnership would last 73 years until Laura's death in 1915, and by most accounts, it was a genuinely close one. Rockefeller consulted her on business and philanthropic decisions throughout his life, and later credited her, along with his mother, as one of the two women who shaped his character most. By 1865, still in his mid-20s, Rockefeller made the pivotal decision that separated him from every other refiner in Cleveland. He bought out his partner, Maurice Clark, who wanted to run the business more cautiously, and refocused the entire company on aggressive, relentless expansion. Within a few short years, thanks to his obsession with efficiency and his ruthless cost-cutting, his refinery became the largest in Cleveland, and Cleveland itself was becoming one of the largest refining centers in the entire country. In 1870, Rockefeller formally incorporated his growing empire under a new name, one that would soon become one of the most powerful and feared words in American business: Standard Oil. He brought in his younger brother, William Rockefeller, and a sharp, aggressive financier named Henry Flagler as key partners. The name itself was a statement of intent. Standard implied consistency, reliability, and quality, a subtle jab at an industry full of fly-by-night refiners producing wildly inconsistent, sometimes dangerously flammable kerosene. Rockefeller and Flagler understood something that most of their competitors hadn't fully grasped. In the oil business, the railroads held enormous power because refined oil had to move from Cleveland to the East Coast ports and cities, and rail was the only practical way to move it in bulk. Whoever could control their relationship with the railroads could control the entire flow of oil in America. So, Rockefeller went to the railroad barons, men connected to the powerful Vanderbilt rail lines and their competitors, and made them an offer. Because Standard Oil could guarantee an enormous, predictable, massive volume of freight every single day, he demanded steep secret rebates on his own shipping rates, discounts far below what any other refiner was paying. But he didn't stop there. In a scheme that became known as the South Improvement Company, Rockefeller and a small group of allied refiners arranged something even more devastating. They didn't just get discounts on their own oil, they got kickbacks, called drawbacks, on the shipping rates paid by their competitors. That meant every single time a rival refiner shipped a barrel of oil on those railroads, a portion of the money that rival paid went straight into Rockefeller's pocket. His competitors were unknowingly funding his empire every time they tried to do business. When word of the South Improvement Company scheme leaked out in early 1872, it caused an immediate and furious uproar across the Pennsylvania oil region. Independent producers, upon discovering that their own shipping payments were secretly subsidizing the very man trying to put them out of business, were incensed in a way that went beyond ordinary business rivalry. It felt like betrayal on an industrial scale. They rioted, formed protective associations, boycotted the railroads involved, refused to sell crude to any refiner connected to the scheme, and successfully pressured lawmakers and the railroads themselves to have the arrangement officially killed within weeks of its exposure. Newspapers across the oil region ran furious editorials naming Rockefeller directly, and effigies of Standard Oil executives were reportedly burned in protest. On paper, it looked like Rockefeller had suffered a stinging public defeat, and one of the few genuine humiliations of his early career. In reality, He had already learned everything he needed to know, and the damage to his rivals in Cleveland was just beginning. Because even without the official South Improvement Company scheme in place, Rockefeller still had the leverage of Standard Oil's massive volume. And he still had private rebate deals in hand. Deals that were harder for outsiders to prove or challenge precisely because they were negotiated quietly, refinery by refinery, rather than announced as a formal cartel. In the spring of 1872, in an episode that oilmen at the time simply called the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller moved with terrifying speed and precision. Over the course of a few weeks, he approached one Cleveland refiner after another, men who had once been his competitors and neighbors, men he had known for years, some of whom he attended church with, and showed each of them, privately, his cost structure and his rebate deals. He proved with cold documentation exactly what it cost him to produce a barrel of refined kerosene versus what it cost them, and that as long as he had those secret rail rates, they simply could not survive competing against him, no matter how hard they worked or how well they ran their own operations. Then he offered them a choice, delivered calmly and without theatrics. Sell your refinery to Standard Oil now, at a fair price, paid in cash or in Standard Oil stock, or stay in business and watch me bankrupt you within the year. It wasn't an idle threat. He had the numbers to back it up, and the refiners, once they saw those numbers laid out in front of them, knew it too. Many of them walked into those meetings prepared to fight and walked out having sold their life's work within the hour. Within roughly 6 weeks, Rockefeller bought out 22 of Cleveland's 26 oil refineries. Some of those men who sold became wealthy Standard Oil executives and shareholders for the rest of their lives, essentially joining forces with the machine that had crushed them. Others who refused to sell simply watched their businesses collapse under the pressure soon after, unable to match Rockefeller's prices and unable to find alternative shipping arrangements that made economic sense. It was, in that single moment, the precise instant John D. Rockefeller stopped being a competitor in the oil business and became something the world hadn't quite seen before, a controller of an entire industry. Not every sale during that period was a straightforward negotiation between equals, and one case in particular followed Rockefeller for the rest of his career as a symbol of exactly how the acquisitions could look from the other side of the table. A refiner named Robert Backus had built a modest, well-regarded refinery in Cleveland, and when he died, his widow found herself, like so many of the other refinery owners, facing a buyout offer from Standard Oil during the very same weeks of the massacre. She later testified, years afterward during the antitrust investigations, that she felt she had been pressured into selling for a fraction of what the refinery was genuinely worth, at a moment when she had little practical ability to run the business herself and few other buyers willing to compete against Standard Oil for it. Rockefeller and his representatives always maintained that the price paid was fair, given market conditions at the time, and the dispute was never conclusively resolved either way. But the story of the widow Backus, true in its particulars or exaggerated in the retelling, became exactly the kind of anecdote that stuck to Rockefeller's reputation for decades afterward. A human face put on the abstract idea of a monopoly squeezing out anyone too weak to negotiate on equal footing. The following year brought a test of a completely different kind. In September of 1873, the collapse of a major American banking house triggered a nationwide financial panic, setting off a punishing economic depression that would drag on for years and wipe out thousands of businesses across the country. Credit dried up overnight, banks failed in city after city, and countless companies that had expanded aggressively during the boom years suddenly found themselves unable to pay their debts. For most of Standard Oil's remaining rivals, the panic of 1873 was a death sentence layered on top of the pressure Rockefeller was already applying. But for Rockefeller himself, who had spent years hoarding cash reserves and running his company with almost no debt, the panic was less a crisis than an opportunity. While weaker competitors scrambled just to stay solvent, Standard Oil had the liquidity to keep operating normally, and Rockefeller used the depressed prices of the mid-1870s to acquire even more struggling refineries and pipeline interests at bargain valuations. It became a pattern that would repeat throughout his career. Where other businessmen saw economic downturns as something to survive, Rockefeller treated them as a clearance sale for buying up exactly the assets he wanted at exactly the moment his competitors were least able to resist selling. With Cleveland conquered, Rockefeller turned his ambitions outward toward Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, and eventually the entire country. Using the same playbook, superior efficiency, secret rebates, and the constant looming threat of being crushed, Standard Oil absorbed refinery after refinery throughout the 1870s, moving through the industry region by region with the same clinical precision he had used in Cleveland. Rivals in other cities had usually heard what happened in Cleveland by the time Standard Oil's representatives came calling, which in some cases made the process even faster. Plenty of refiners chose to sell before Rockefeller had even fully turned his attention their way, having watched what resistance had cost their counterparts in Ohio. But as Standard Oil grew large enough to dominate entire regions, the railroads that had once been his greatest allies started to become a liability. Railroad executives, realizing just how dependent, and therefore powerful, Standard Oil had become, began trying to push back, raising rates or threatening to work with rival refiners instead, uncomfortable with how much control they had ceded to a single customer, however large. Most businessmen in Rockefeller's position would have simply negotiated harder or looked for a middle ground. Rockefeller instead decided to make the railroads themselves obsolete to his business. Beginning in the late 1870s, Standard Oil poured enormous sums into building a network of long-distance oil pipelines, stretching from the Pennsylvania oil fields directly to refineries and coastal ports. It was an enormous engineering undertaking for the era, requiring the company to buy up rights of way across farmland and hillsides, lay thousands of miles of iron pipe, and build pumping stations to push crude oil over terrain that railroads had once been the only practical way to cross. Pipelines were faster, cheaper, and entirely under Standard Oil's own control. By quietly building this pipeline empire, Rockefeller didn't just solve his railroad problem. He put the entire American oil supply chain, from the wellhead to the kerosene lamp, under his own private control, and in doing so, flipped the old power dynamic entirely. Railroads that had once dictated terms to oil refiners now found themselves competing for the scraps of freight business that Standard Oil's pipelines didn't already handle. By this point, Standard Oil had grown so large and operated across so many different states that it ran headfirst into a serious legal problem. 19th century American law made it illegal for a corporation chartered in one state to directly own and operate companies in other states. A rule originally meant to protect states from being dominated by outside corporate interests. Rockefeller's solution to this obstacle, engineered largely by his brilliant and unscrupulous lawyer Samuel Dodd, was one of the most significant legal innovations in the history of American capitalism. In 1882, they created the Standard Oil Trust, a structure in which shareholders across dozens of formerly separate Standard Oil companies handed their stock over to a single board of 9 trustees, who then managed the entire network as one unified, secretive empire from a headquarters at 26 Broadway in New York City, while each individual company kept up the legal appearance of independence for regulators and the public. It was a masterstroke of legal engineering, and it worked so well that other industries, sugar, whiskey, tobacco, steel, and eventually dozens more, rushed to copy the trust model for themselves, giving rise to an entire era in American history, now remembered as the Age of the Trusts, a period in which a handful of unified industrial giants came to dominate one sector of the American economy after another. By the mid-1880s, Standard Oil controlled somewhere around 90% of all oil refining capacity in the United States. It set the price of kerosene in nearly every American household, from tenement apartments in New York to farmhouses on the Great Plains. It decided which independent producers survived and which quietly went bankrupt. In practical terms, one company, run by one relentlessly disciplined man from Cleveland, now controlled the lifeblood of America's energy supply, deciding in effect how much it would cost an ordinary family to light their home after dark. That secrecy couldn't last forever. In 1892, the state of Ohio's own Supreme Court ruled that the Standard Oil Trust violated Ohio law and ordered the Ohio-based Standard Oil Company dissolved out of the broader trust structure, the first serious legal blow the empire had ever suffered. Rockefeller's lawyers, never short on creativity, responded with another piece of legal engineering almost as clever as the original trust itself. Rather than genuinely breaking anything up, they reorganized the entire empire in 1899 under a new umbrella. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, taking advantage of New Jersey's unusually permissive corporate laws, which allowed a single holding company to legally own stock in companies across every other state. On paper, this satisfied Ohio's ruling. In practice, it changed almost nothing about who controlled the empire or how it operated. It bought Rockefeller and his partners another decade of relatively undisturbed operation. And it would take a far larger legal effort at the federal level to finally force the kind of breakup Ohio had originally intended. Small, independent oil producers throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio, men who had risked everything drilling their own wells, found themselves at the mercy of a company that could set prices however it wanted, buy their oil at rock-bottom rates, and had the pipeline and rail leverage to strangle anyone who didn't cooperate. Some producers who tried to organize collective resistance found their oil mysteriously unable to find buyers, or discovered that the pipelines they depended on to move their product had suddenly become unavailable to them, without any public explanation ever being offered. Whole towns that depended on independent refineries watched those refineries close, taking local jobs, local suppliers, and local tax revenue with them, as Standard Oil absorbed or crushed the competition and consolidated refining into a smaller number of larger, more efficient, but more distant facilities. Rockefeller himself remained personally almost invisible during this era, rarely giving interviews, rarely explaining himself publicly, running his empire through a tight, disciplined inner circle rather than through public charisma, preferring to let the numbers and the results speak for him, rather than ever defending his methods in the court of public opinion. That silence only deepened the public's suspicion and resentment, allowing rumor and legend to fill the space where an explanation might otherwise have gone. By the 1880s and 1890s, the term robber baron had entered the American vocabulary, and no name was more closely associated with it than Rockefeller's. He was, to millions of ordinary Americans, not a hero of industry, but a cold, faceless octopus with tentacles wrapped around every part of their daily lives, squeezing profit out of a substance, kerosene, that their families relied on simply to see in the dark once the sun went down. The strain of running that empire, and of being the single most vilified businessman in America, eventually showed up on Rockefeller's own body. In the early 1890s, he began losing his hair, and for the rest of his life, he wore a series of custom-made silver wigs in public. That public anger eventually found its most devastating and effective voice in a journalist named Ida Tarbell. Tarbell had grown up in the Pennsylvania oil region herself. Her own father's small oil business had been one of the countless casualties of Standard Oil's expansion decades earlier. Though she approached her work determined to rely on facts rather than personal grievance, spending years tracking down former Standard Oil employees, sworn court testimony, and internal company documents rather than simply venting old family grievances. Beginning in 1902, she published a meticulously researched, multi-part investigation in McClure's magazine, methodically documenting, with real internal documents, court records, and interviews, exactly how Rockefeller had built his empire, the secret rebates, the crushed competitors, the ruthless tactics of the Cleveland Massacre and beyond. She even managed to secure a rare, tense interview with one of Rockefeller's own former partners, and pieced together, financial record by financial record, a case that was far more damaging precisely because it wasn't driven by outrage, but by evidence. Her work, later collected into a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company, was a sensation. Serialized over 19 installments and read by millions of Americans as it unfolded. It transformed vague public resentment into a detailed, damning, and largely accurate public record of exactly how Rockefeller had operated. For the first time, ordinary Americans could read, in plain language, precisely how the richest man in the country had gotten that way, and precisely how many smaller businessmen, farmers, and families had been squeezed along the way. The political consequences followed quickly. President Theodore Roosevelt, who had built much of his reputation on trust-busting and reining in the excesses of massive monopolies, made Standard Oil a central target of his administration's antitrust efforts, singling the company out repeatedly in public speeches as the clearest example of exactly the kind of unchecked corporate power he believed threatened American democracy itself. Federal prosecutors filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act, arguing that the company's dominance had been built and maintained through illegal restraint of trade rather than fair competition. The case wound through the courts for years, drawing on the very documentation Tarbell had helped surface. And finally, in 1911, the United States Supreme Court delivered its landmark ruling. Standard Oil was found to be an illegal monopoly, and the court ordered it broken apart into 34 separate independent companies within 6 months. It was, on paper, the single greatest legal defeat of Rockefeller's career, the moment the empire he had spent 50 years assembling, refinery by refinery, pipeline by pipeline, was forcibly dismantled by the federal government he had spent decades quietly outmaneuvering. By 1911, Rockefeller himself had already stepped back from day-to-day control of the company for over a decade, spending his time on his estates and increasingly on his philanthropic projects. So the ruling landed on an empire he had built, but no longer personally ran. And then came one of the great ironic twists in the history of American business. Investors, expecting the breakup to devastate the value of Standard Oil's stock, instead watched something remarkable happen. Freed from the antitrust scrutiny and public hostility that had weighed on the parent company, the 34 newly independent companies, which would go on to become giants like Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and Conoco, among others, several of which would later recombine and merge back together in different forms across the 20th century. Each began trading and operating on their own, and their combined stock value soared far beyond what Standard Oil had been worth as a single unified entity. Rockefeller, who as the largest individual shareholder held stock in nearly all 34 new companies, saw his personal net worth skyrocket in the years immediately following the very breakup that was meant to punish him, reportedly doubling his fortune within a few years of the ruling. The federal government had set out to dismantle his empire and, without ever intending to, made him significantly richer than he had ever been before, turning the government's greatest victory over him into, financially speaking, one of the best things that had ever happened to his personal bank account. By this point in his life, though, Rockefeller's relationship to his own fortune had already begun to change, guided in large part by a Baptist minister, an advisor named Frederick Taylor Gates, whom Rockefeller had brought on years earlier, specifically to help him manage the flood of charitable requests pouring in from every corner of the country. Gates convinced Rockefeller of something that ran directly counter to the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life accumulating, that giving money away carelessly in small, scattered donations could do more harm than good, breeding dependency rather than genuine progress. Instead, Gates argued, Rockefeller should apply exactly the same rigor, the same relentless efficiency, and the same systemic thinking to his philanthropy that he had once applied to crushing his oil competitors. That shift, however, did not mean the Rockefeller name was suddenly free of controversy. In April of 1914, at a coal mining operation in Colorado, majority owned by the Rockefeller family, a bitter months-long miners' strike ended in horrific violence when the Colorado National Guard and company-hired guards attacked a tent colony of striking workers and their families, killing more than a dozen people, including women and children, in an event that became known as the Ludlow Massacre. Public outrage exploded, and much of it landed directly on the Rockefeller name, even though, by that point, it was Rockefeller's son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who held the more active role overseeing the family's coal interests. The elder Rockefeller, now in his mid-70s and long removed from daily business operations, found the family name once again synonymous with corporate ruthlessness at the very moment it was trying to become synonymous with generosity instead. In response, the family made an unusual and, for the era, genuinely pioneering move. They hired a former journalist named Ivy Lee, often credited as one of the founders of modern public relations, to help repair the family's public image. Lee encouraged the Rockefellers toward more visible, more personal gestures of goodwill, and it was around this period that John D. Rockefeller Sr., already in his later years, began the habit that would define his public image for the rest of his life far more than any pipeline ever had. Carrying rolls of shiny new dimes in his pocket and handing them out personally to children, hotel staff, and strangers he met on the street, often with a small smile and a word of encouragement about saving. It became so closely associated with him that the newspapers covered it almost as regularly as they once covered his business dealings, slowly reshaping the public caricature of Rockefeller from the octopus of the political cartoons into the elderly, generous man with a pocket full of dimes. What followed that shift was an act of giving on a scale the world had genuinely never witnessed before. In 1892, years before the great antitrust battles had even reached their climax, Rockefeller had already provided the founding funds for the University of Chicago, transforming it within a matter of years through sustained and enormous additional gifts into one of the great research universities in the world, complete with a Gothic campus and a faculty stacked with leading scholars lured from universities across the country and Europe. In 1901, he established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York, the first institution in the country devoted purely to biomedical research rather than teaching, staffed with scientists given the freedom and funding to pursue long-term research without the pressure of immediate commercial application, an almost unheard-of arrangement at the time. That institute would go on to produce multiple Nobel Prize winners and breakthroughs in the treatment of diseases like meningitis and diphtheria, along with foundational discoveries in genetics and virology that shaped 20th century medicine. Perhaps most strikingly, in 1909, Rockefeller's philanthropic arm launched a sweeping campaign to eradicate hookworm disease across the American South, a parasitic infection spread through contaminated soil that had quietly sapped the health, energy, and educational potential of millions of poor Southerners for generations, leaving entire communities chronically fatigued and dismissed by outsiders as simply lazy, when in truth, they were suffering from an easily treatable but widely ignored disease. His foundation funded public health surveys, treatment campaigns, and education efforts across the region, dispatching doctors and health workers county by county to test, treat, and educate rural communities that had never before received any organized public health attention at all, and later expanded similar public health initiatives internationally, funding campaigns against yellow fever and malaria in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, helping build the foundations of what would eventually become modern global public health infrastructure. In 1913, he formally chartered the Rockefeller Foundation, with a stated mission simply to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world, backing it with an endowment so large that it remained one of the largest philanthropic foundations on Earth for generations afterward. By the time he died in 1937, Rockefeller had given away more than $500 million, a genuinely almost incomprehensible sum for that era, equivalent to many tens of billions in today's money, to causes in medicine, education, and public health that continue to shape institutions still operating today, from major universities to global health organizations that trace their origins directly back to programs he personally funded. His final decades were quiet by comparison to everything that came before. He spent much of his time at his estates, most famously Kykwit in New York, tending obsessively to his rose gardens and playing golf almost daily well into his 90s, reportedly using a young reader to keep him updated on the newspaper each morning, and a personal physician to monitor a diet and routine he managed with the same rigor he'd once applied to freight rates. He outlived his wife Laura by more than 2 decades and largely handed control of both the family's remaining business interests and its philanthropic empire to his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who spent much of his own life trying to further soften and reshape the family's public image, including funding the restoration of Colonial Williamsburg and the construction of Rockefeller Center in New York. The elder Rockefeller lived to see his 98th year, finally passing away peacefully in his sleep at his winter home in Ormond Beach, Florida, on May 23, 1937, just a few months shy of what would have been his 98th birthday. He died the richest man of his era by an enormous margin, having spent roughly the first half of his adult life building the largest, most feared industrial monopoly the world had ever seen, and roughly the second half of it trying, in his own methodical way, to give nearly all of it back. So, who, in the end, was John D. Rockefeller? He was a man shaped in childhood by two opposing forces. A con man father who taught him the world was a game to be won through cunning and nerve, and a disciplined, unyielding mother who taught him that every single penny mattered and nothing should ever be wasted. He took those two lessons and built, through decades of calculated ruthlessness, secret railroad deals, crushed competitors, and an almost inhuman obsession with efficiency, the largest and most dominant industrial monopoly the world had ever seen. A company so powerful that the United States government itself was forced to tear it apart by law. And then, in the second half of his life, that same relentless, systematic mind turned its full force toward giving that fortune away, laying groundwork for modern medicine, higher education, and public health that still touches lives today, generations after his death. So, the question worth sitting with isn't which version of Rockefeller was the real one. It's whether those two versions of him were ever really separate at all, or whether the same cold, disciplined ledger book mind that built the monopoly was, in the end, the very same mind that gave $500 million away.